Welcome to the Catholic Community Scripture Study, held at St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church in Jackson, Michigan. I will be your host, Todd Gale, as we walk our way through the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Hello, my friends. What an honor it is to have you join me every week in walking this walk with me. I'm enjoying it just tons, and I would do it because I want to do it. And I thank you so very much that you're participating. It just makes me so happy to share the word with folks. We're in chapter 15 of the Gospel of Matthew. The leaders from Jerusalem are now about to question Jesus. So in the last chapter, he calmed the storm and walked on water, and he fed 5,000 people, and there were big groups of mass healings. And now the scribes and the Pharisees come from Jerusalem and ask him why his disciples are not washing their hands in a ritual cleaning. It appears that they have come from an official delegation to question and investigate Jesus. Now, the tradition of the elders here that they're talking about, that does not mean the tradition of Moses, does not mean the prophets. It means the traditions and the laws and the rules taught by scribes and Pharisees through the last several decades, last couple hundred years leading up to Jesus. And they're very upset because the disciples are not washing their hands when they eat bread. What? Are they concerned about germs? No, it has nothing to do with hygiene. They wanted to follow the laws of cleanliness, to be ritually clean for the temple. Now, here's what the Bible says about ceremonial washing in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. The Old Testament tells us in Leviticus 15 that a man must have a full body washing to make himself pure after intimacy with his wife. And anyone who touches the man who has had intimacy with his wife has to wash his hands and his clothes, and then he has to do a full body washing as well. Priests were required to wash their hands and feet before service in the temple. And Exodus 30 with Aaron and Moses talks a little bit about priestly washing. And as far as the Torah is concerned, the 5 books of Moses, the Old Covenant, that is all there is about hand washing. That's it. Apparently, their thought was if it was good enough for the priests, why not have all the people wash as well? The idea is basically similar to our idea of washing hands in the modern world, except it has nothing to do with germs and microbes. They wanted to ritually cleanse their souls. They wanted to wash away sin. They wanted to wash away uncleanliness. They wanted to wash away things that were not holy. It has nothing to do with washing away germs. To make the skin physically clean. The problem is this custom and this tradition that they're following, for one thing, it's not scriptural. It does not come from God or from Moses. But the other thing is that they saw sinfulness and uncleanliness everywhere they looked. It's kind of like childhood cooties. A non-Jew is unclean, they automatically have cooties. And their cooties, their spiritual uncleanness, their spiritual cooties were contagious, and they could spread very quickly. So if a pure Jew touched something that was not clean, they would catch the spiritual cooties. And washing ritual got rid of those spiritual cooties. Now, according to the custom of ancient Israel, or not ancient Israel, that's the problem. According to the custom of newer Israel, the hands were washed on a number of occasions whenever a pure Jew would come in contact with someone or something unclean, like a Gentile or a corpse or an unclean animal or blood, imagine how unclean a Jewish person would be after shopping in the local meat market, especially when that meat market would have Gentiles selling their wares as well. Just imagine dead animals, blood, Gentiles, all sorts of unclean things. So in the years after the Jews returned to Jerusalem, back in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, like around 450 BC or so, up to the time of Jesus, hand washing became the norm before and after eating a meal with matzah bread, with unleavened bread. And it became the norm when you woke up, after using the latrine, before prayer, after visiting a cemetery, or if you come in contact with any of those things that we just mentioned a moment ago. And sometimes the water was poured from a cup. Other times it was delivered by a bowl or a pitcher. Sometimes so that they didn't accidentally touch something and make it unclean with their hands, they would use their elbow and they would bump on like a little spout, a little faucet. In some of these occasions, there was a blessing. In other occasions, there was not. And more rules got added over time. Like if you're washing your hand and the water dripped on the unclean on the hand that you're cleaning and it's washing away the uncleanliness, okay, and that water drips onto this hand, now this hand is contaminated, okay, and so now you've got to wash this hand and this hand. And starting to wash with the palms down is what they started to do with their fingers spread apart. And they'd turn it over because sometimes, but sometimes the water would run between the hands and it would contaminate and they'd have to wash it again. So they started to do a thing where they would wash the back of their hands and then they'd close their fists to make sure that none of the water dripped out of their unclean fists onto the other hand. And they would hold one hand back and wash it, and then they would hold another. It was just starting to get a little silly. And they were worried that they were never clean enough. No matter how much time they spent washing, no matter how much water, it started with fingers. It became washing the whole palm and the whole hand. It became washing down below the wrist. And by the time of Jesus, they're washing past the elbows. It's what in Judaism, they sometimes call it building a fence around Torah. Like if you wash up to your elbows, there could be no doubt about it being clean. It's going way beyond the bare minimum to make sure you don't break the law. That's building a fence around Torah. An example of that is, I love this one, to make sure that you're not guilty of plowing your field on the Sabbath day, of working your field. You're not allowed to spit in the ground, lest your spit digs up a little bit of earth, and therefore you're plowing. So you're not allowed to spit at all on the Sabbath on the ground, so that way there's no way you could ever be accused of plowing. Likewise, a woman was not allowed to look in a mirror, because if she saw gray hair and or something that needed fixing, she would have to work on that. She'd have to pull that hair, and that would be work. So don't even look at a mirror on a Sabbath day. That's building a hedge around Torah, right? Now I know we've got just as many silly rules ourselves, but it's a little more fun and a little easier to poke fun of other people, right? But anyway, the ancient Jews took this tradition like super seriously. There was even a rabbi at the time of Jesus named Rabbi Joseph, and he taught, "He sins as much who eats with his unwashed hands as he who lies with a harlot." Can you imagine that? For not washing your hands, which is not, by the way, in the Bible. It's not in their Old Testament. For not washing your hands is the same as lying with a harlot as far as sin is concerned. Now remember, this law given by God, the law of the commandments and the law of Moses, says nothing about the need for lay people to ritually wash their hands before a meal. So when the disciples are accused, Jesus answers with an accusation back to them. He was very strong in his reply because these leaders are so caught up in minutia, these goofy details that they made up. Jesus repeated what the scribes and Pharisees had already mentioned. This is based on the leaders' tradition. And Jesus, what he does is he says, well, they're upset with the disciples because the disciples aren't washing their hands. But Jesus says, but you folks are breaking a commandment, one of the 10 commandments, all the time. And that doesn't concern you? But not washing your hands does concern you? And what he talks about is how it has become very common to neglect their father and mother. This is what St. Mark, in Mark's gospel, he calls this Corban or Corban. And what this is, there's a clear command from God that everyone has to give honor to their father and their mother. This commandment even states a penalty if you disobey this, right? This is the only commandment that has a penalty attached to it. And one of the chief ways in the ancient days you could honor your parents was to provide for them when they got too old to work, right? But the Pharisees and the scribes were more and more finding a way around giving money to their parents. Basically, if you set aside all your money into a special bank account, right, or into a special treasure chest that you buried in your backyard, that was from a couple episodes ago, right? If you had some money and you pledged that money to give the money to the temple or to the synagogue to do God's work, then you didn't have to spend any of that money on mom and pop because, you're doing a holy thing for God. So basically it's saying, sorry, mom and dad, God is more important. Meanwhile, they pledged the money to the church, to the synagogue, to the temple, but they didn't have to give that money right away. They could hold on to it as long as they needed, as long as they pledged it as the Corban. Now, this probably tricked a few Pharisees and Sadducees into thinking that they were being so religious and so holy by following this temple rule, the synagogue rule that they invented while they are disobeying their own parents. They're not honoring their father or mother. Well, Jesus is really not pleased with this. And once again, he calls them hypocrites. And then he quotes again from Isaiah, where Isaiah talks about the same thing happening 600 years before Jesus. People draw near to the Lord with their mouth, but they don't honor him with their lips. Their hearts are far away from the Lord. Their worship is vain. They're teaching doctrines, the commandments of men. So they're saying the stuff that men made up are the things from God. This is from Isaiah 29. And Jesus didn't say all traditions are bad. He didn't say all traditions are good. He's saying don't treat a commandment that men made up as if that's a doctrine that God has given you. And I think this was a really big slam against y'all Catholics. I mean, I was raised Baptist, and I pretty much was taught Catholics follow the traditions of men. They made up this crazy stuff about priests and Mary and saints and popes and sacraments. They just made all this stuff up. None of that came from Jesus. There were rules of men, and there's a lot of it. But that's just completely not true, and even the slightest bit of study would reveal that that's really, really bad thinking. In the Catholic Church, the sacred tradition that we believe in, the capital T, sacred tradition, is not just stuff made up by men, by priests in the Middle Ages. Sacred tradition is doctrine that does come from Jesus. It comes from Jesus and his apostles directly. Apostolic tradition. Right? Jesus does not condemn the commandments that flow from him and the apostles. He condemns the things that are taught and passed down that are not from God. They're not guided by the Holy Spirit. We might call those kinds of teachings heresies, right? And the ironic thing is that as a Baptist, and lots of Protestants point their fingers at Catholics, accusing Catholics of following the traditions of men, well, Protestants follow the tradition of whoever their particular leader is. They ignore 1,500 years of apostolic teaching to follow the traditions of Martin Luther and John Calvin and John Wesley and Jonathan Smith and all the rest of them. Now, my intention is not just to be another finger pointer. I don't want to just blame other people and point fingers. But we need to really examine ourselves. And we need to take this to heart, right? And we need to really think about the way that we're worshiping. Is the way that we're worshiping truly from God? Or is it like these silly rules that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are making up, and the scribes, these silly hand-washing things that were never handed down by God? Do we honor Jesus with our lips, but not our hearts? Are we hypocrites? Is our worship vain and meaningless and powerless? Now, I love that word hypocrite. I know we've talked about it previously because Jesus has used it a lot. That word hypocrite in the Bible is found 18 times. All of them are in the New Testament. All of them are in the Gospels. All of them come from the mouth of Jesus Christ, right? He's the one that calls people hypocrites. Remember, that means a stage actor, a faker, someone who wears a mask, a pretender, an actor. And he's not just calling them individually fakers. He's saying their entire system of rituals of the Pharisees, it's all phony, it's all vain, it's all without merit. And the Pharisees are furious with Jesus. So then he calls the multitude to himself, which is really, really cool. And he talks about how every plant which God the Father has planted, if he has not planted it, he's going to uproot it. So just leave those guys alone. They're just blind, leading the blind. And then Peter asks him to explain the parable, and Jesus talks about how things don't defile you that go in. What defiles you is what's in your heart. These are verses 10 through 20. Can you imagine having Jesus say, come over here and sit down and let's have a little talk? He just had an epic smackdown with the Pharisees, and then he's going to come talk with the common folks, right? And that's what he does every time he calls you to read the word. Every time we go to the liturgy of the word at Mass, it's really Jesus talking to us. He's really there communicating with us. What does he mean by this whole thing? What goes in is not impure, but what comes out is impure. So eating with unclean hands, he says, is just simply not sinful. And maybe he's even hinting at the idea that the non-kosher foods of the Jews, the forbidden foods, maybe he's hinting at the fact that that's all going to go away. It really doesn't make you impure or unholy or sinful because of the things you eat. But what he's going to say is that sinful, foul, judgmental, accusatory words coming out of our mouths, it reveals what's in our heart, and that means our heart is really defiled. Our heart is really unclean. And I just love the apostles. They just crack me up. They're so real. Jesus, did you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard your saying? It's like hilarious. Of course he knew that he offended them. He wanted to offend them. And he says, every plant which my Father has not planted will be uprooted. That reminds me back of the parables that he told earlier with the weeds and the wheat. The enemy sows the weeds, and when harvest comes, they're going to get pulled up and they're going to get thrown in the fire. And he says the blind are leaders of the blind, and when that happens, they both fall into the pit. Well, blind in what way? They can't see the truth. They can't see their way and the truth of life that stands right in front of them. They're blind to the truth, and they're blind when they lead other people. And then the disciples ask him to explain the parable. Well, I mean, which thing are they asking an explanation for? He just talked about the blind leading the blind, lies being uprooted, the defilement that comes from inside, and really none of them are parables. I mean, they think he's speaking in parables, but Jesus really isn't telling parables here. These are more analogies and metaphors. Well, what does he explain? When he starts to explain the parable, he's not talking about the other things. What he's talking about is that whole concept that what you eat does not make you sinful. It doesn't make you unholy. So we're assuming that's the thing that they thought was a parable that they wanted explained. He says basically what you eat goes in your stomach and then it comes out in the latrine. It doesn't affect our soul. It's eliminated. But if the heart is impure and if the mind is blind, what we do and what we say demonstrates that what's really sinful, what's really unholy, is already in us. Your words and your actions show what's in your heart and your true character. To eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. He makes this very clear. And then Jesus answers a Gentile's request. This is starting in verse 21, one of my favorite scenes in the entire Gospel of Matthew. I love this character. I love this scene. Part of it is because I used to really dislike this. I did not like this. Jesus does not seem like himself here. Seems like he woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. He a request from a woman in a Gentile region. So Jesus goes from there. He departs to Tyre and Sidon, and a woman comes, a Canaanite, and she cries out, "Have mercy on me, son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." These lines are loaded right here. First of all, for the setup, it's really important that we catch something, which we probably wouldn't know unless we took some time to look at a map. Tyre and Sidon are Gentile cities located some 50 miles to the northwest of Capernaum. Matthew sounds like they just took a little stroll, but this is like 2.5-day journey to get there, right? It's 50 miles. So some think that what happened was the Pharisees were so mad at Jesus, he just split. He went way north into the Gentile territory because he knew the Pharisees would never follow him. I'm not sure if that's what happened, but that makes kind of sense. Matthew doesn't explain any other event that takes place in this region, except this. It looks like Jesus went all the way there to meet this Gentile woman. Isn't that interesting? And Matthew uses the old term, Canaanite, to show that she's clearly one of Israel's enemies, one of the ancient enemies of Israel. Sidon was the firstborn son of Canaan way back in Genesis chapter 10, right? And Canaanites were deep, long enemies of Israel. Mark's gospel, he calls her a Syro-Phoenician, in the territory of Phoenicia, where a lot of the Syrians had lived. But Mark wants us to see that she's a Canaanite. Now, the Canaanites were the group of people that were enemies of Israel that lived in the Promised Land. They were the ones that were originally in the land before Joshua got there, before Joshua started to drive them out. And they were enemies of Israel all throughout the Old Testament. They included the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the snake bites, and the mosquito bites. And I really like this character. Did you catch that? Did you catch that little joke? I don't know if you heard that. I said snake bites and mosquito bites, right? No, actually they're called the Jebusites and the Perizzites. Um, these 7 different people groups, these 7 different smaller clans, made up all of the Canaanites, made up all of Canaan. Remember this 7. This is really important. And I love this woman. I love this character. She is so awesome. I would like to know her background. I'd like to know what motivates her. What does she know? We just don't know anything about her. She asked Jesus to have mercy on me. Her daughter is severely demon possessed, like the centurion way back several chapters ago, like Jairus, the synagogue leader. This Gentile woman somehow heard of what Jesus could do, and she has the faith and the guts to go to him and plead for him to intercede. And somehow she knows who Jesus is. Remember, his own people in Jewish cities didn't believe in him. Like his own town folk didn't believe in him, his own hometown. But she calls him Lord, the divine title, and she calls him Son of David, the messianic kingly title of the Jews. And she's an enemy of Judaism. She's a Canaanite. There's something about her. Who is she? And her daughter is severely possessed by a demon. I don't know if you can be mildly possessed by a demon. I don't know if that happens. Jesus has healed Gentiles a few times before, but they always come to him in Jewish territory. Here, Jesus goes into Gentile land, and he seems to make sure that their paths cross. The play that happens here really looks like a setup, doesn't it? Now, one thing that I want you to see here, I think this is really cool. She says to Jesus, "Have mercy on me, Lord." And remember, this is written in Greek. Have mercy on me, Lord. Eleison Kyrie, she would say, or Kyrios. Kyrie eleison. Have you heard that before? What does that mean? It means Christ have mercy. Lord, have mercy. We say that in the Mass. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. It's Greek. So at Mass, we use the words, we repeat the words of this Canaanite woman of faith. Isn't that interesting? Now, Jesus' response here is very cold. He doesn't answer her. And his disciples say, just send her away because she's crying after us. But then Jesus answers and he says something that's like, this is just horribly racial. This is like just a terrible ethnic slur. He said, I wasn't sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay, it's going to get worse. In other words, I didn't come for her. I came for Israel. Now, St. Augustine said, the Word said not a word. And that was so unlike him. Jesus didn't answer her. Why? Her courage. He knows her faith. Could he be fishing for a little stronger response from her, maybe? Or maybe this is a setup to teach the disciples. Or maybe both. I've always read this like the disciples are totally annoyed. She's an unclean Gentile woman, and they say, look, just give her what she wants and send her away. Just do what she wants. But Jesus says to that, I wasn't sent to help her. I was sent to help the lost sheep of Israel. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second. Did Jesus mean, I was sent for the few lost sheep that are in the house of Israel? Or did he mean, I was sent to Israel who are all lost sheep? In particular, who are the lost sheep here? I don't think it's the Canaanite woman, right? I don't think it's her. He has come for the lost sheep. That's why he's with his apostles who are all Jewish. And in a weird way, this was something that I was toying with. In a weird way, is he affirming her? Could he mean, look, I came for the lost sheep. These guys are definitely lost, but you're not a lost sheep. My mission is to them first. They need me first. They need me more. Could he be actually kind of building her up and affirming her? I just think that's really interesting. But then what she does, when Jesus says, I didn't come for you, she kneels before him. And this is one time I don't like the Revised Standard Version's translation. It's the same word that's used for kneel or for adore, honor, and respect. It's also the word used for worship. And it looks like in the context, she worships him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and he said, this is where it's really bad. This is really racist. It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. It's not good to take the bread that belongs to Israel and give it to the dog Gentiles, right? She doesn't get angry. She doesn't push back. She doesn't leave crying. She says, yes, Lord. Yet, even the dogs can eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table. So she's in a position of worship, and the apostles must be aghast. In a way, she's saying, look, I don't need a shepherd. I'm not lost like Israel. I need a savior. And notice she says, help me. She doesn't just say, help my daughter, right? I need help healing my daughter. I don't care about being, ferreted around by a shepherd. I really need you. Oh man, I really like this woman. I like this character a lot. Now, Peter Jesus and called out, save me, in the previous chapter. Here there's a Gentile woman calling out, Lord, help me. But he's not a Jewish disciple that's been following Jesus for 2 years. She's a Gentile. It would be expected that a Jew that's been following Jesus for 2 years is gonna finally get to the point of worshiping him. She's hard, as far as we know, she's never met him. She's already on her knees, and she's already saying the same things that Peter said after months with Jesus. It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. I want you to notice how many times bread comes up in this chapter. We've already heard it a couple times. Jesus is continuing to say discouraging things to her, but she doesn't take it as an insult. Now, you might know that Jews in general hated dogs back at this time especially. Dogs were just feral beasts that ran in packs like wild wolves, and they harassed travelers and rummaged through garbage. They were just scroungy street mutts. But Jesus calls her something specific. He calls her a little dog, a small lap dog, a household domesticated dog that belonged in a family, which they would have their own portion of food that the master of the house would feed it. The little dog, the pet, didn't have to take away food from the children because the master of the house gave the dog scraps and crumbs from his own plate. Does that not twist the way this whole thing reads? In other words, it's like she says, Jesus, I'll take the little portion of your healing that's meant for us Gentiles. I don't mean to take anything away from the children of Israel. There's enough to go around. I don't need their portion. I need what you have for me. Oh my goodness. I wish I could hear Jesus's, the tone of his voice right here. I used to think he was snarky and sassy and angry in the scene. I thought he just was in a really foul mood this day. But now I think this is like winsome. This is like playful. Like he totally gets her. She totally gets him. I almost think he's saying, it's not good to take food from the children, as he dramatically points to the apostles, and give it to the little house pets. And he does a wink wink at her, right? I think he was saying this almost with great fun, and the woman replies with great faith. She accepts that Jesus refers to her as a pet, right? I really like her. And it's almost as if she knew, maybe she heard that some of the children of Israel, they didn't want anything to do with Jesus. They didn't believe. And maybe she was saying, but I do believe. You don't even have to give me their share. I'll just take the crumbs. Isn't that a really fun way to look at that scene? Now, I want to look at this whole general section from an airplane view. Remember the chiasm that we talked about earlier, the way Matthew writes a lot of times? He does sort of a ladder going up with the same themes going down. So he'll do A, B, C, and then he does C, B, A. Well, I want you to look at the layout of the last couple chapters. A chapter ago, Jesus fed 5,000 Jews with bread that was multiplied. Then Peter was tested and he shouted, Lord, save me. That's A and B. And then C, he lacked faith. Peter did. But in the end, he worshiped and he called Jesus the Son of God. A, B, C. 5,000 Jews, Peter's tested, Lord, save me. He lacked faith. But in the end, he worshiped. And then we go down the ladder. Here's a Gentile woman who does not lack faith, who worships. And she calls him Lord, Son of David. And she is tested like Peter was tested. Peter said, Lord, save me. She says, Lord, help me. And on the downside of the ladder, at first, Jesus fed 5,000 Jews with multiplied bread. The very next thing that we're going to look at, Jesus is going to feed 4,000 Gentiles with multiplied bread. A, B, C, C, B, A. Interesting. And what does she call the miracle that she expects, right? The healing that she's waiting for? What is the woman playing into in this whole kind of analogy? She calls this crumbs of bread. I want you to notice that. Bread. This scene with a Gentile asking for crumbs of bread takes place between the two miracles of bread. 5,000 Jews, 4,000 Gentiles. And she's willing to accept the crumbs. Isn't that interesting? So Jesus says to her, Woman, great is your faith, and her daughter was healed from that very moment. Jesus has never said anything like this to another person. He did compliment the great faith of the Roman centurion, but he said it to the crowd. Back in chapter 8, he said, I've never seen such faith. But here, he speaks directly to this woman, and he says, Daughter, a woman, great is your faith. Now, significantly, these are the two people, the centurion and this woman. They're the ones who received the great compliment from Jesus, who both have their lines in our Mass today. Lord, have mercy, and Lord, I am not worthy to have you enter under my roof. These two Gentiles with great faith, right? We repeat their words at Mass. And then I know we're long today. Verse 29 to 31 through the rest of the chapter here. Jesus departs from there. He skirts the Sea of Galilee. He goes up the mountain, and he heals the blind and the mute and the maimed and many others. The setup here is really important. Most commentators believe that he's in a predominantly Gentile region of Galilee, off to the eastern shore of Galilee, where the hills are, where the pigs had leapt off some time ago. Especially because Mark tells us Jesus in this scene is in the region known as the Decapolis, which is Gentile area to the east. And these Gentiles were growing in numbers and glorified the God of Israel. Another reason why we're pretty sure these are Gentiles, because they glorified not God, but the God of Israel. That means they were not of Israel. So they're learning to praise the God of Israel. Well, now Jesus calls together his disciples and he says, we're healing all these people. They're hungry. We have an exact repeat. Some of the words are the exact same for the miracle of the feeding that happened just a few paragraphs ago. Only the numbers are very different here. The location's different and the people are different. This miracle follows the same pattern as the feeding of the 5,000. So why did the apostles ask, where are we going to get the bread? Like, are they really that dense? Did they already forget? No, I think maybe the disciples could not fathom the fact that Jesus would do the same miracle with Gentiles, especially after he just said, I didn't come for the Gentiles, I came for the Jews. Well, obviously, he was not ignoring the Gentiles, right? And the numbers here are very important. This is what we'll end with. The first feeding was 5,000 people, 5 loaves, right? 2 fish, 12 baskets of leftovers. 5,000 people. In the Jewish mind, 1,000 people is a Jewish way of just saying a whole bunch of people. A bazillion people were there. It was a great number. And 5 times a bazillion, 5 times a great number, could be the 5 books of Moses. So it's all that great number of people who follow the Torah, the people who of the law, the great multitude that follows the law. They're Jewish. And we talked about the 5 loaves and 2 fish a couple episodes ago, or maybe just last episode, actually. 5 loaves, meaning the law of Moses. The 2, meaning the prophets and the writings. So the 5 and the 2 make the Old Testament. The Old Testament writings, the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. And so that number, the Jewish Bible, is placed in Jesus' hand, and he multiplies it out to feed all of this bazillion of Torah followers, right? The bazillion of Jewish people, and there's enough leftovers for all 12 tribes of Israel. 12 baskets. This feeding, this is very interesting. The number is 4,000. Well, Gentiles were a people that came from the 4 corners of the earth, north, south, east, and west. And there's a bazillion of them. So 4,000 is a number that very much means a lot of Gentiles. That's what that would symbolically mean. And there are 7 loaves. 7 loaves. Do you remember how many Gentile nations were mentioned earlier that made up the enemies of Israel, the Canaanites? There are 7 different Gentile nations, right? The Jebusites and the Herbicites and all the rest of them, what are the mosquito bites and shark bites, right? 7 of them make up that nation. So it's like the 7 nations are placed into the hands of Jesus, and he can multiply this out, and he can feed them all. In fact, he feeds them with enough leftovers for all 7 people groups, 7 tribes, 7 clans. That 7, it's a perfect number for sure in one sense, but it also represents this Gentile number, right? There's 7 leftover baskets, an abundance to fill all of the Gentile peoples, just like before, an abundance to fill all of God's peoples, right? Isn't this so cool? This is so cool. Next week, we finish chapter 15 all in one session. Next week, chapter 16, Matthew 16. This is a big one. This is a huge turning point in the whole salvation story and in the history of the church. And it's a really, really big deal. And we'll have a special guest joining us next week. Can't wait. I just can't wait. I hope you're hanging in there and as half excited about this as I am. Thanks, everybody. God bless. Thank you so much for walking the way through the Gospel of Matthew.